Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The U.S. promises the most intense day yet in Iran. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as the U.S. and Israel conduct their strongest attacks in Iran so far since the start of the conflict, just a day after President Trump declared the war very complete. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, says the country is absolutely not interested in a ceasefire right now. As we like to say sometimes, the enemy gets a vote.
Well, this is the thing. Even if the U.S. is ready to wrap things up, that is not to say that Iran is, or Israel,
Correct.
For that matter. Something else we have to consider is this is joint Israeli and U.S. action that is being taken, not the U.S. unilaterally. And certainly you're getting some mixed messages, not just from within the Trump administration itself, from the president itself, but also between the U.S. and Israel. We'll get into that this hour with Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace.
There's potentially some sunlight between our objectives here as these two countries work in tandem. But Kailey, of course, we're watching the situation in the energy markets as well. Crude oil prices are ever lower once again today, despite the fact that nothing really has changed. You could actually argue that it's worse as the UAE shuts down its biggest refinery and nothing's passing through the strait.
Yeah, the strait is still effectively closed off, and yet you're seeing oil prices, both Brent and WTI, down 13%
Big move.
today. Yes, we're still higher than before the conflict started, but we're nowhere near the triple digits 120 level that we touched just yesterday. That was yesterday.
Far cry. It's really incredible, the reversal that we've seen. We're going to talk about this in a moment with Tyler Kendall, who's at the White House. She's got the latest on the administration's plans. We may or may not see the president today, but we do have a news briefing that's scheduled with the press secretary. And we'll talk to Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman, who's at the GOP retreat still underway in Miami. That's where the president spoke last night.
Yep. Well, be interested to get the take from the congressman of what the feel was like in the room, if they have a clear idea of the president's timeline and objectives when it comes to Iran. So we'll get to all of that this hour. But for the check on oil prices that we were mentioning and the markets beyond that, we turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi. Thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. Indeed, all eyes very much on energy, specifically crude. Right now, West Texas Intermediate crude dropping 13%, $82.60 for a barrel of WTI. Brent, the global benchmark, at $86.50. Barrel of Brent down now by 12.6%. Bottom line here, oil lower, stocks higher. S&P up 31 now to 68.26. That is a gain of 0.5%. S&P 500 rising as crude moves lower on hopes that the world's largest economies will be deploying their oil stockpiles. The Dow up 292, up 0.6. NASDAQ up by 0.7%. The VIX at 22, the 10-year 4.11%. Spot gold up 1.7%, 52.28 a barrel. And again, West Texas Intermediate crude down 13.8%, 81.75. Bitcoin up 3.3%, 71,280 on Bitcoin. Keeping an eye on some of the oil names, specifically the oil ETF, the United States Oil Fund ETF, USO on the ticker. It is down 4.7% among oil majors. ExxonMobil down 1.1%, Chevron down 1.2%, and ConocoPhillips right now down by 1.9%. Again, looking at a 14% drop now for West Texas Intermediate crude, with the S&P up 0.5. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe and Kailey.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking on the markets for us. Thank you so much. Clearly, markets have seized on the narrative that emerged from a phone call President Trump had with a CBS journalist yesterday, the idea that the war could be over very soon, that he thinks that the objectives are getting close to complete. Pretty much, and that's a quote. Of course, that doesn't necessarily match the rhetoric we got from President Trump when he spoke in Florida yesterday on the idea that, yes, the U.S. is winning, but there is more to be won, that they want to see some degree of completion of the mission here, though that may not still be clearly defined. And all the while, we hear from the Defense Department, or the Department of War, as Pete Hegseth likes to call it, that things are only intensifying in terms of our operations when it comes to Iran, not easing up. This was Secretary Hegseth at a briefing this morning.
Today will be yet again our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The last 24 hours have seen Iran fire the lowest number of missiles they've been capable of firing. We will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated.
On to Truth Social, the President of the United States earlier today, if Iran does anything that stops the flow of oil within the Strait of Hormuz, they will be hit by the United States of America 20 times harder, in all caps, than they have been hit thus far. A far cry from the war being very complete. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall is on the north lawn of the White House to begin our coverage this hour. Tyler, how do we rationalize the rhetoric coming from the Pentagon, the White House, and Iran, which now says it's not interested in a ceasefire right now?
Well, Joe, I think both of you really set it up perfectly that there seems to be a little bit of tension here when it comes to a potential timeline. Now, President Trump outlining yesterday that the U.S. is ahead of schedule, in his words, when it comes to achieving its objectives, but that he doesn't expect the conflict to be resolved this week. Then pair that with Secretary Pete Hegseth earlier today outlining that the U.S.'s will to achieve its goals are endless, but he said that this operation is not going to be endless. And we heard him reiterate how the U.S. is measuring progress, perhaps outlining those goals, including destroying Iran's ballistic missile program, but also the industrial base used to create those weapons, destroying Iran's naval and Navy capacity, and then making sure that Iran will not be able to ever deploy a nuclear weapon. So we're looking for some sort of update when it comes to how the U.S. is actually measuring how it is working towards these targets. As Pete Hegseth said earlier today, that the U.S. has so far hit more than 5,000 targets in Iran. But then, as you mentioned, we got this statement from the Speaker of Iran's parliament saying that they absolutely not are looking to negotiate and have a ceasefire. And then I'll also point you to a statement overnight from the IRGC saying that the military intends to continue to block oil flows and exports when it comes to the region. And you mentioned President Trump's post on Truth Social earlier today. Yesterday, we heard him say actually that we could see the list of U.S. targets widen to hit electricity infrastructure if disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz do continue. And by most metrics, they are. Traffic in the Strait has effectively come to a halt. As Joe and Kailey, Bloomberg News reporting this morning that it appears that electronic warfare is now being deployed to jam the signals in the Straits, which is only complicating the matter more for those vessels that are supposed to be heading through.
Well, it's incredible, Tyler, as a red headline just crosses the Bloomberg terminal that oil is extending declines. We are now down 15% on the day, trading back near $80 a barrel on WTI. This is a far cry from where we were just at this time yesterday, certainly from the early trade Sunday into Monday, which speaks to the idea that President Trump clearly is cognizant of the market. If the Strait of Hormuz cannot be opened up in the near term, what other action domestically do we understand the administration may be prepared to take when it comes to gas prices, which are still higher than they were when this conflict started, even with the declines we are seeing?
Well, I'll actually give you first the international coordinated effort that we could see, as the G7 did ask the International Energy Agency today to draw up scenarios about potentially drawing down those emergency stockpiles. And President Trump himself has said that the U.S. is looking at some other potential options, right? He had floated the idea that we could see the U.S. Navy escort tankers through the Strait. I'll point out that the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, was asked directly about this and said that the military was prepared to draw up scenarios if that option ended up being fulfilled or asked by the president, but it doesn't seem that that scenario has been built just quite yet. And then people familiar with the matter telling Bloomberg News just yesterday that there are these other tools in the toolkit that the administration is eyeing, including potentially a federal gas tax holiday. I'll point out that that would require congressional approval. We could also see potentially some intervention in the oil futures market. And then this idea that we could actually see a tapping of strategic reserves amid some questions about replenishing the SPR. I pulled the latest statistics earlier today. The SPR right now is at 60% capacity, so there could be some room here, of course, but the administration had been denying that that was really an option that they had ultimately wanted to tap. So we'll see as it goes from here, because Kailey, you're exactly right. This is a White House that has been trying to message around affordability concerns, but as retail gas prices go up, it's going to be something that puts the administration on the defense.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And as we consider the White House messaging around affordability, around gasoline prices, around this conflict in Iran, we got many messages from President Trump yesterday, either via interviews like the one with CBS that really turned the markets around into the close in the Monday trade, or in statements that the president has given, both to Republicans at their retreat in Doral, at his facilities in Doral, or in the press conference that followed. Here's a taste of the words of President Trump yesterday.
This was just an excursion into something that had to be done. During this brief disruption, we're way ahead of schedule, and it's going to be ended soon. And if it starts up again, they'll be hit even harder.
So we want to speak now with someone who was there in the room where the president spoke yesterday. Congressman Marlin Stutzman is with us. He's a Republican representing Indiana's 3rd District, joining us live from Doral, and we appreciate it, sir. Welcome back to Balance of Power here on Bloomberg. When you heard the words of the president, both in the ones directly to you and your House colleagues and in the press conference after, do you have a sense of clarity as to when exactly this conflict is going to be wrapped up and what we will have achieved at the end of it, what we still may have yet to achieve?
Yeah, Kailey, great to be with you. The president is taking the information day by day that comes in. One of the things that we all know and are seeing is that our military is performing just incredibly. And the fact that, the intelligence that was gathered on the front end gave our military the ability to go in and take out the Iranian assets at the pace that they did is truly remarkable. And, I think for us as Americans, our attention span can be very short, and we want these things to happen quickly, just like, with the Maduro case where our military was in and out overnight was incredible. But, we have to realize that these things do take some time and that this is going to be a long-term situation that is going to have to be dealt with. And I think President Trump is handling it.
How long is long-term, Congressman?
Well, I think we're going to operate as quickly as possible. We want to destroy the assets, and we want to see that the Iranian regime is decimated. And, as was said earlier on the program, that, the other side has a vote in this. I think that they're going to continue to, use their propaganda to try to drag this out as long as they can, like they always do. But in reality, I think we know that this is going to be a shorter situation. The mission is already mostly accomplished, but of course the transition and the changes over there still have to be made. My hope is the Iranian people really step up, and they're the ones that start to make the changes in the government that need to be made with the support of a coalition that has really come together very strong in the Middle East and here at home.
Well, I guess to your point, Congressman, and it's good to have you back. Thanks for joining us. I know it's a gorgeous day in Miami right now. That research coming from Rapidan Energy would suggest that we could be in for a lot more of this. U.S. military operations, Rapidan writes, have not yet meaningfully degraded Iran's ability to disrupt Strait of Hormuz traffic and are likely to do so for several weeks. This updated disruption outlook indicates that barring a ceasefire and the resumption of Hormuz flows, crude oil could get back into the mid-100s, kind of like we saw in the panic that brought us to $120 almost yesterday morning. How worried are you that we actually have not seen the worst of this yet?
Well, I think there's definitely concern, and there's natural concern. I mean, who wants to take the risk of traveling through there right now? But it was just announced that President Trump just put together a $20 billion underwriting insurance program and is telling these ship operators and these shipping companies to move and to continue to operate, and that we've taken care of the Navy, the Iranian Navy, that they're no longer a threat. Of course, China wants to see activity. Most buyers and sellers of the almost 20% of the oil and gas that comes out of the Persian Gulf area and through the Straits of Hormuz is able to move. And so I think that President Trump, who is a businessman, knows that while there is instability with the military attacking Iran, that it does create uncertainty, but by coming back on the backside with an insurance program and confidence, saying that they can move, hopefully will make a difference. So I think really, to Kailey's question earlier, I think within a month from now, we're going to have a very different conversation.
Well, as we consider the Strait of Hormuz, it is worth noting that the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, actually just posted on X that President Trump is, in his words, maintaining stability of global energy during these military operations against Iran. He says the U.S. Navy successfully escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz to ensure oil remains flowing to the global market. So when we consider that escort, Congressman, and you mentioned also the insurance underwriting, that's billions of dollars as well. All of this comes at a cost via military resources or others, which raises the question, and given your seat on the Budget Committee, I'll pose it to you, how we're going to pay for this, if we need more funding to pay for this, and whether that's going to come through just a supplemental bill or maybe a second reconciliation package.
Well, it could probably come through either one of those. It depends on what the needs are. A reconciliation bill is going to move, but it's going to probably take time. Now, one thing that we have seen is that getting things through the Senate, sometimes you have to package them together, like we did with the one big beautiful bill. There may have to be a second big beautiful bill to be able to move through. But if it's a supplemental, I think that there will also be strong Republican support. And I think that the fact is that President Trump he moves quickly. He wants to find solutions and get things moving without as little disruption as possible. But as we all know, that the markets get scared, people don't want to take the risks, and so there is going to be a price to pay for that. So I would answer that with stability there comes a price. It's much easier for terrorists to shoot a $2,000 rocket when we have to have a $200,000 rocket to respond to it, to knock it out of the sky. So safety and security does come with a price tag. And I think that that's why it's important to do this now before we ever gave Iran a chance to have a nuclear weapon, and they would be leveraging the West from here for eternity.
I'd love to ask you about the messaging conversations that you're having at the retreat, Congressman. But just quickly, do you expect that supplemental request from the White House this week, as some had reported?
I don't know if it'll be this week. I think they're probably still analyzing a bit. But you know what? They may have the numbers that come from the Department of War. They have a pretty good idea of what the daily costs are. But I think that, I would suspect maybe over the weekend or the request comes, and then we'll have to take it up next week when we get back to Washington. But I think that there's a lot of positivity around the actions, the mission that has been accomplished in Iran. Just watching the Iranian people here in America, the Iranian Americans that are celebrating because this regime is being changed. I don't have any problem saying that there needs to be a change in regime in Iran, and the fact that we have taken out the military capabilities that they've had, the nuclear capabilities that they were working on, giving the Iranian people a chance. I think that the Iranian people are the real difference makers here that are going to really guide the direction of Iran. Just like I said, the same thing with Syria. And Syria is making a good move in the right direction. So having opportunity for the people will produce good results, I hope.
Well, we're covering the globe here, and I want to ask you about the Ayatollah's son now, Congressman, and that's the issue. We've now talked for about 10 minutes, and we haven't brought up the issue of affordability. In our remaining moment, are you having conversations there? Is there a plan for members like yourself and the Republican conference to message around this war when it comes to affordability in America?
Yeah, Noel, that's exactly right. Things here at home are getting better. Inflation is down. Of course, what we passed in the big, beautiful bill addresses the tax policy that is now going to benefit Americans. We're just coming into tax season, and the Treasury Secretary is doing a phenomenal job of communicating what is happening, and that people are seeing more money being left in their pockets rather than going to pay the federal government's spending sprees over the last several years. When people have more money in their pockets, that's going to spur on the economy. As I was just talking to some sales folks back home, they don't see the urgency yet, but they are starting to see that people are just kind of building up and ready to make moves here over the summer. So I think, again, this summer we'll see a much more active market.
Well, I guess we'll all be hoping for fat tax returns this year. Congressman, thank you so much for the insights. Again, redhead on the terminal, the Navy escorting an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. It has happened. This is Bloomberg.
We track this remarkable move in oil. Yes, it was an outsized move to the upside yesterday before a complete reversal on the headlines from Trump's interview, a conversation with CBS suggesting the war could end soon. Now, even more downward pressure coming today, and the leg lower continuing after this headline from the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who says the Navy has successfully escorted a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, President Trump suggested the U.S. Navy would be willing to do in order to combat higher oil prices, which when he launched these combat operations when it comes to Iran over a week ago, he said he anticipated. This was the president yesterday evening.
I knew oil prices would go up if I did this, and they've gone up probably less than I thought they'd go up. We're also waiving certain oil-related sanctions to reduce prices. When the time comes, the U.S. Navy and its partners will escort tankers through the strait if needed.
And here we are. It's actually happened, as Kailey mentioned, the president adding some thoughts on Truth Social to write, if Iran does anything that stops the flow of oil within the Strait of Hormuz, they will be hit by the U.S. 20 times harder than they have been hit thus far. Additionally, we'll take out easily destroyable targets that will make it virtually impossible, he says, for Iran to ever be built back as a nation again. Death, fire, and fury will rain upon them. We assembled our political panel for their take. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne Zaino, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, with us for more on this. Rick, when you hear the rhetoric from the president, you see now that we're actually escorting tankers through the strait. This is essentially a no-fly zone that we're standing up here. Can we afford to do this for weeks?
Well, it's certainly within the capacity of the Fifth Fleet, our Navy presence in the Gulf, to be able to carry out these maneuvers. They train this, they do war games around it, they know what they're doing, and it's no easy task. The Gulf is a very shallow body of water. The pinch point at the Strait of Hormuz, you could throw rocks into Iran as you sift your way through there. So it's taking these tankers through a war zone, and it's great for the price of oil. Obviously, we see movement just off the announcement. That's important for the rest of the world. But I would worry that this is an escalation on the part of the military, a new phase of the war, where we're putting our service members and our military at risk in order to deliver oil to who? Mostly this oil goes to Asia, and half of it goes to China. And I think that's a real political risk for the president if anything happens.
Well, and the president was saying that out loud in his press conference yesterday, Jeanne. He actually said this really is standing to benefit China, that it's an honor to do it. How does that message ring here at home?
Not well. It was, on top of saying he knew oil prices were going to go up, he is saying that this is going to benefit China. He said so many things during that press conference that were really Orwellian, to the point that you couldn't really make sense of them. At one point, he said, we could do it the easy way or the hard way. And I think the hard way is the easy way. And you just stop and think, what is he talking about? And so none of this works for him politically. It is a risk. It is an escalation for the U.S. Navy to do this. And it is an escalation just hours after the president said this thing was near over. And oh, by the way, we're going to keep going. So it's hard to know what to make of it, except this is bad for the United States. It's bad for him politically. And I guess the winner here, thank you, Donald Trump, is China.
Well, the old don't take him literally, take him seriously line. Rick Davis is even challenged by what we've heard in the last 24 hours. The war was very complete, according to what he said yesterday. And now we're doubling down to what Pete Hegseth calls the most intense day of bombing yet. Assuming that the military is outperforming, and that has been the report from every quarter, what about the rhetoric and the way voters are supposed to interpret what they're hearing? The president did hold a news conference last evening, and it was a bit of a weave. Does the administration need to be more direct, more on point with the American people?
Sure. I would say that at best, the communication strategy around this entire thing has been stressed out. President never went to the American public at the beginning and said, this is why we are doing what we're doing. This is why I have asked to spell our blood and treasure in a place like Iran. This is why it's important to the American people. So that didn't get done. So since then, it's been pretty much backfilling. This is what happened today. And sometimes it's good news, sometimes it's bad news. Certainly the bad news the public tracks is how many American service personnel die in this effort, because that is the most sensitive political issue in America ever. And so, I don't think this administration is really on top of their game. Pretty clear last night, the president was saying things that were not echoed by the Secretary of War today. This is always the challenge with doing press briefings. You expose yourself to inconsistencies within the administration. So it's incumbent upon this administration to communicate clearly to the public, and it's on them if they don't. And in an election year like this is, it makes it even more important. So we'll see whether or not they sort of get their comms act together. But right now, they seem pretty spread thin on that.
Well, and to this point, there's new polling out from Ipsos around public sentiment around the war in Iran. Overall, just 33% of those polls say that President Trump has clearly explained the goals of U.S. military action in Iran. 64% said the administration has not adequately explained the objectives or haven't done so clearly. And to Rick's point, Jeanne, there was also overwhelmingly 54% or very, 31% somewhat concerned about risk to the lives of American military personnel. There's concern in here about the cost of military action and the economic impact here at home. The vast majority are concerned about that. But President Trump has suggested that he doesn't care about polling around this issue. So I wonder, when we think about the tone shifts we have gotten from the president, whether or not they're consistent, if you think that is more reflection of political reality or market reality, market forces that the president is considering.
Primarily to market forces. He does care an awful lot about his own image, his legacy, how he is viewed in the media and in polls. But of course, he discounts the polls that don't show him favorably, and he, holds up those that do. So I'm not surprised with these really bad numbers out of Ipsos, out of Quinnipiac. I mean, it is across the board. He is, of course, going to say, oh, these polls don't matter. And I think, just to step back and say, the president spoke for 90 minutes yesterday, Kailey, and you and Joe listened to the entire thing. And what did we get out of that? We got completely mixed and muddled messages. None of this is normal. Over 1,500 people have been killed. We have an energy crisis. We have a president and administration who don't agree on why we're there. We have an Ayatollah's son who is now the supreme leader after having his wife, his children, and his father killed. He is more hardline than the previous. And we have 900 pounds of nuclear material sitting in Iran. And they are saying, job is almost done. This is looking great. None of this is normal. None of it makes sense. And the American people are right when they say, we do not support what is going on here. And they need a Congress to back them up in that.
Rick, we're talking about the president's messaging to the American people. How about to members of Congress, and specifically the Senate? There's great reporting today by Bloomberg's Matt Shirley that you can find on the terminal and online, that several Senate Democrats are threatening to force war powers votes and disrupt the chamber unless Republicans agree to hold public hearings with key Trump administration officials on the reasons for the attacks on Iran. That doesn't sound like something the Trump administration is about to do. Does this bring ever more dysfunction to the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one more layer of dispute between Democrats and Republicans on top of layers and layers of issues that they're trying to fight through. And you see Republicans sort of, bouncing from side to side on this. Many of these issues are really stressing out Republicans who want to see government function, who want to see things move along, and want to support the president on the war, but have been given very little to go on. I mean, there have been many classified briefings, and this is the complaint the Democrats are making. If you're willing to sit with the entire Congress and tell us these things, frankly, that we read in the New York Times the next day, then what's the good of having a classified briefing? Because really what we are is the greatest press conference known to man, Congress. We communicate to the American public through these hearings, and that's why they want public hearings, because they want this administration to go on the record to explain to the public why they're doing what they're doing, not just at the Department of War in a daily press briefing, not just the president in the back of the plane. They want this stuff on the record in the Congress so that the American people can judge the consequences. It shows just how polarized the politics of all this is, and it doesn't stop at the water's edge anymore. It goes with war also.
Well, could it not also in some way serve the administration, Jeanne, when we're talking about the communication problems? Why not just go testify and make the case that you have arguably been making in press conferences, whether it's at the Department of Defense or President Trump last night?
Yeah, I mean, Kailey, it couldn't get much worse from a communications perspective. So I do think, and I do hope the Democrats are successful in getting them there. The problem for the administration is there is no clear objective as to what they are doing, how long this is going to go on, why we are there. They have been all over the map. So imagine you drag these people in. How are they going to make this any clearer? This starts and ends with Donald Trump. In 90 minutes, he stood up there yesterday, and it was like you were rereading some kind of 1984 George Orwellian newspeak as he went from one side to the other. This is almost over. It's not over. We're going to win. We haven't won. I mean, it was back and forth, and they won't be able to change that.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them, our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. And we still have more ahead as we turn to Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace on Israel's factor in this equation. That's next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
A remarkable turn. We've been talking about the reversal in oil prices. We just saw a reversal of a tweet from the Energy Secretary. Kailey, this is remarkable. This is the post that brought crude oil, WTI futures, below $80 a barrel. We had a 7 handle a couple of moments ago. It is now gone after the tweet was deleted. Chris Wright had said that the U.S. Navy successfully escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz to ensure oil remains flowing to global markets. He even had a video attachment of him making that announcement. He said it occurred about 36 hours ago. Kailey, the Energy Department, or Chris Wright himself, has deleted that tweet. You retweeted it at one point. It is no longer available.
No longer available. Of course, the tweet being deleted is not the same as the Energy Department coming out and saying that this escort didn't happen or that this wasn't successful. We do not know that for sure, but certainly the market is trying to take a cue here, knowing that it really has been very, very vulnerable to each and every headline that crosses about this. We saw the reversal that happened yesterday on the headline of Trump speaking on the phone with CBS, suggesting the war will be over soon. So this is clearly just a market that is twitchy.
Well, that's for sure.
We want to say
As
so.
the president says, has the yips. Right now, crude oil is down about 15%. We're still looking at big declines here today, but back above $80, just about $81 a barrel right now. Energy stocks haven't been moving a lot here as we wait for the next cues on what the president's talking about, essentially ensuring these shipments through the strait. But the strait outside of this ship is still largely, if not closed, unused.
Yeah, and remember, President Trump on True Social overnight suggested that if Iran does anything to stop the flow of oil within the Strait of Hormuz, that they will be hit by the United States of America 20 times harder than they have been hit thus far, going on to say death, fire, and fury will rain upon them. So we want to get into this now with Aaron David Miller, who's joining us from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he is a senior fellow. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Aaron, it's great to have you. When you consider the rhetoric we have heard from President Trump just in the last 24 hours, let alone over the course of the last 10, 11 days, where are we right now on the escalatory or de-escalatory curve?
I mean, wandering all over the parking lot. This is a war of choice, not necessity. And in wars of choice, wars of discretion, the metrics and standards for evaluating success are much higher because presumably in a war of choice, there was no imminent or immediate threat to the security or prosperity of the United States. And frankly, as of February 23rd, that statement still stands. The administration has toggled back and forth. I think they've settled, more or less, on the narrative that not only did the president and the Israelis help kill these Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, and by the way, this is a transformative act. There's no doubt about it. Iran is not going to be the same country after the decades rule of a guy who basically championed death to Israel, death to America, used proxies to spread Iranian influence in 4 or 5 capitals, and frankly bankrupted the country by the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, or at least a nuclear weapons program. But I think they've settled on a narrative that they have basically undermined, to use the president's favorite word, obliterated Iran's capacity to project its power abroad, and with the Israelis, taken a major whack at the instruments of state repression that have been used to repress and oppress demonstrations and the Iranian public for decades. Regime change? No. I think after 11 days, it seems to be clear that the headline is the trend line, that this regime, the IRGC, and remember, to control Iran, you need access to money, you need access to guns, and you need access to oil. And the fact is, there's only one organization, security services, and the IRGC, that has that sort of influence and power. So 11 days in, I mean, can we speculate? The war could be over next week. It could last for another several weeks. This is the problem with a war without defined objectives.
Well, so we have a new supreme leader. The regime is holding, as you're pointing out here, Aaron David Miller, and we wanted to talk to you about some of the sunlight that we're finding between U.S. and Israeli objectives. Does the Ayatollah's son, the new supreme leader, have a price on his head? Does he need to stay indoors for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I would think, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the Israelis killed in the fall of 2024. His successor, Hashim Safieddin, lasted 6 days. Maybe Mujtaba Khamenei will last longer. But I think, no, the Israelis are going after leadership targets. They live in the neighborhood. And on this one, look, let's be clear. We're Venus, the Israelis are Mars. The Israelis really do have an existential threat should Iran actually cross the nuclear threshold from a threshold weapon state to an actual weapon state. So they're in that respect, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, would like to see the war last for another several months so the Israelis can continue to degrade not just Iran's ballistic missile production and its inventory, but their leadership targets as well. But make no mistake, when Donald Trump decides the war is over, Benjamin Netanyahu will comply. Rarely has an American president, I worked in administrations from Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, and I'd throw in Obama and Biden into that mix. Rarely, if ever, has an American president had more leverage over an Israeli prime minister. Because for Netanyahu, the one organizing principle in 2026 is not Iran, it's not Gaza, it's not Lebanon. It's re-election. And the fact is, if the government goes to term in October 2026, or if elections are advanced, which they may be, until June or July, Benjamin Netanyahu needs Donald Trump as an active campaigner, not as a passive one, an active campaigner, which means that when Trump says jump, the issue for Netanyahu, maybe I'm phrasing it a tad too strongly, is how high. So no, if Donald Trump wants the war over and the Israelis to stand down or to de-escalate or push it into another phase, Netanyahu is going to comply.
But what about Iran? Is Iran likely to comply?
And that is the key issue. Will the Iranians let Donald Trump de-escalate? That is a critically important question, because what Iran has now established is, one, regime stability and the cohesiveness of the Revolutionary Guard, and two, that what we're calling horizontal escalation. They can't go up directly against the U.S. military or the Israeli military, but they can escalate horizontally over a discrete area, and they're demonstrating with a terrifying clarity the power they have, and they probably latent capacity, if they're holding stuff back, and I think they are, to basically make life extremely uncomfortable, both for oil markets and for the Gulf states, who crave security and stability, and thought, when they allowed the Chinese, Saudis, to broker this détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that's what they were getting. And look, guys, in this part of the world, geography is destiny. And as far as the Gulf states are concerned, yeah, they can continue to rely on the United States, but it hasn't stopped the Iranians from disrupting life basically as they know it. The proximity guarantees vulnerability, and they are vulnerable.
It's great to have you back. Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We've been looking forward to this conversation, Aaron. Thank you for being part of it. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, alongside Kailey Leinz. The Tuesday edition of Balance of Power takes a strange turn today as we learn that the Energy Department has deleted the post that got the markets churning a short time ago for the better. We had a 7 handle on crude oil And Kailey, it looks like we've given that up. About $81, still down quite a bit, down sharply, 15%. But evidence of a U.S. military escort for an oil tanker through the Strait got investors' attention. That is what Energy Secretary Chris Wright was announcing in the post that has since been deleted. So we don't know if that did occur or if there are more nuances around this story. But Kailey, we're certainly pairing some of the losses that we saw before.
Yeah, so let's get into this now with Jeff Mason, who's a White House correspondent for us here at Bloomberg, here with us in our D.C. studio. Jeff, do we have a sense of whether this did indeed happen and maybe it's just the rollout of communication failed, or was this something that hasn't happened yet and they jumped the gun?
No sense yet. It's very fresh. I will say that there's a White House briefing coming up at 2 o'clock, so that will be an opportunity to ask directly at the briefing what the deal is. Here are a couple scenarios. Number one, it could be that it didn't happen. You're right to ask that. Number two, it could be the communication issue. Number three, and related to number two, it could be that the secretary got ahead with what is major news of the president. And that's always a no-no in the cabinet. And President Trump in particular likes to announce big news. You may recall that the day that the Iran war was announced, we were waiting for confirmation that the supreme leader had been killed. That confirmation ended up coming directly from the president because that was a major headline and he wanted to make it. It's possible that that's the case here. I don't know that. Just laying out some potential scenarios.
Do you get the sense that this administration is aware of how sensitive the energy market is to each word that's coming out of the White House? Because the rhetoric has been a little confusing for the last 24 hours.
True that. I think that the administration and the president himself are aware of the impact that this war is having on energy markets. Certainly aware of how important it is to bring those prices down. We've talked a lot on these shows and when we're together about the political impact of this war and the political risk of higher gasoline prices heading into the midterms for President Trump. So I think you saw some of that at play with his comments yesterday, suggesting that the war was going to end earlier than he has said, but then offering a contradictory comment on that later when he said that there could be even harsher attacks. So that's a long way of saying, Joe, yes, I think they do realize that, and yet it doesn't necessarily make them more careful.
Well, so regardless of what happened here, the fact that a post was made and then deleted, does that not just speak to the idea that across the varying cabinets within the Trump administration, there is a serious messaging challenge, an inconsistent messaging challenge when it comes to this conflict?
And on an issue that, as you just said, is super market moving. I mean, this is not just a message about something going on at the White House or a new event or whatever might end up on a social media post. This is something that is directly connected to the war, connected to people's businesses, and connected to financial markets.
So we're going to be hearing from the press secretary momentarily. Top of the hour, we're supposed to have a White House press briefing, whether it begins on time or not. As someone who spent a lot of time in that front row, what is her job today, and what's the question you'd be asking?
Well, I think because of the news that we just are talking about, I think my first question would be just that. Did this actually happen? Can you tell us what happened? You know, what ship it was? How did it go? And if not, then how in the world did it come out already and have to then be deleted by the energy secretary? Also, if it happened and you're confirming that, then why was the post deleted and what's the backstory there?
And would you expect an answer?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Oh, Joe, you're putting me on the spot here. I think definitely she will come out with some kind of information about this. She can't really not come out without information about it, but we may not get all the backstory.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll keep tabs on what is said in that briefing room with the help of Jeff Mason. Thank God you're on board, and thank you for jumping in here in the clutch with great analysis, as always. Kailey, we'll keep our eyes on the Twitter feed, I guess, until the late edition of Balance of Power. God knows what can happen between now and then.
Yeah, and keep our eyes on the chart as well. WTI right now hovering just above $80 a barrel and waiting for any further word from the energy secretary, from the president, or any other in the administration. We'll see you later on here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.